Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus. My name's Mike Pierce, as I'm remembering to tell you this time because I forgot on a previous occasion. The Mount Olympus is where the Greek gods lived, and Olympian judgments are the kinds that they gave above all the stupid squabbles of mere mortals, and that's what we try to do. But it's foggy, so we do what we can. These are discussions, grown-up discussions for grown-up people about history, religion and culture and why they matter in the present.
And my name is Coel Campo, and today is the 5th episode in our series Eastern Catastrophes, and this one is called Bloodlands, between Hitler and Stalin.
Bloodlands is the name of a very well-known recent history book by Timothy Snyder talking about this area during the Second World War period. And what is this area? Well, this series, if you've been following us so far, you will know, is Poland and Ukraine, and particularly the overlap between the two, historically speaking. Well, let's start off by me telling you a little personal story. This photograph of yours truly is me having just arrived in Minsk, capital of Belarus, 6 years ago, and going into the metro and arriving at Ploshad Lenina, Lenin Square metro station, and being astounded to see all the communist memorabilia, and even being amazed that there was still a square named after Lenin. If the Soviet Union survives at all, it survives in Belarus. It may not be communist. It's, well, capitalist, but not a free market. So just like Britain and America in that sense. But it hasn't exactly disowned its Soviet past. This next picture is one I took at the Great Patriotic War Museum in Minsk. Some of you will know that the Great Patriotic War was the term used in the Soviet Union and still used in Russia and Belarus for World War II, but it's used in rather a narrow sense to mean the Nazi-Soviet War. So the events that we looked at last time that occurred from 1939 to 41, which were the result of Hitler and Stalin making an agreement with one another to divide Poland and other areas of East Central Europe between them. This isn't even mentioned in public, not in this museum, but not in public discussion generally. Here we have a small town war memorial, and again it's a little harder to see, but the dates on the memorial are just from 1941 to 44, which is ironic because this place, Nyasvij, is west of Minsk and had been Poland between the wars until Stalin took it in 1939. Not even mentioned in Belarusian discourse as in Russian discourse. The war is simply from 1941 onwards, when the Nazis invade. And in the same vein, the castle in Meic, another reconstructed place because everything in Belarus was just destroyed by World War II, included a memorial to this man. Now, this guy, Oswald Rufeisen, is an incredible character, and he is fictionalized in Ludmila Ulitskaya's wonderful 2011 novel, based upon his life. He was, in fact, a Polish Jew who was locked up, along with all the other local Jews, in the Warsaw Ghetto, and organized a breakout of 300 people. He worked for a while for the Germans and for the Soviets, and after the war went on to become a Catholic Christian and a Carmelite monk living in Israel. That's quite a life.
Yeah, and I know you think Russian literature was the world's best in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the 21st century looks set out to be the same. So is this part of that, sort of top-notch output?
Yes, it certainly is. There are other things that we could mention, but this is... I think this novel is going to go down as a classic. It's in that kind of tier, yes. It's one of the most remarkable facts about Russian history, that it doesn't really have any great literature until the Napoleonic Wars, which somehow kickstart them, and then you get this incredible outpouring in the 19th century, and again, despite, maybe even because of, the Soviet Union in the 20th, and the 21st century is set to go the same way.
And this is one of the only pieces of fiction that you've ever recommended to me to read.
Now that's not fair. What about the leopard?
Yeah, that's the other one.
Okay, well, the next picture, another one of my personal photographs, is of a tucked out of the way memorial that's called the Pit Memorial in Minsk. The Jews in Minsk, as in everywhere else across this part of Europe, were almost entirely eliminated during the course of the Holocaust. And in this particular one, 5,000 Jewish residents were murdered in March 1942. Obviously that in itself makes one very uneasy just to go visit that. But one of the things that makes me uneasy is that this memorial is not really given a whole load of prominence in the way that the Museum to the Great Patriotic War is. And I think really it should be. But, yeah. Well, look, before we go any further with this, getting away from the personal anecdotes here about this material, I want us to make a disclaimer from the outset and talk about the really, really big, gigantic things that we are not covering much in this episode. We will give them ridiculously short attention simply in order to set context for what is our story. Right. So the Nazi occupation of Poland and the resistance to it. For those who are interested in this book by Khalid Kochanski, The Eagle Unbowed, is a really good and, as you can see, substantial tome to cover that topic. We're not going to be covering the military conflict between the Nazis and the Soviet Union, even though that is the biggest single part of World War II, actually. And mostly we're not going to be covering the Holocaust. We are considering what's happening under Nazi occupation in Poland and Ukraine, but particularly in the areas where they overlap, like Western Ukraine, what had been Poland's Kresy, and so on, and the point at where these different population groups intermingle.
Yeah, we could make each of these topics an entire series themselves.
Well, we could. Although I'd have to say that they have all been very much covered, especially the second and third ones. But what we do want to do is at least set some kind of context. More than 6 million Poles died in World War II, and half of those were Jews. Nazi occupation was resisted by ordinary people. Collaboration in Poland, unlike in most of the other areas in both Western and Eastern Europe that the Nazis occupied, collaboration was minimal. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it was not at a very high level. And from February 1942 onwards, the Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, led that resistance. And it had about 400,000 people involved in it by 1944.
So the Home Army is just a way of referring to Polish resistance?
Yeah. The Nazis created walled-off Jewish ghettos in major Polish towns and cities. The most famous one, of course, that everybody knows about is the Warsaw Ghetto. And these generated starvation conditions and were generally ended by deporting their populations to extermination camps like Auschwitz, like Treblinka, Majdanek, and so on, once those had been constructed, because they weren't built at the beginning of the war, they were built halfway through. And there can be a tendency for people who perhaps don't spend all their time focusing on this kind of subject to confuse two different major uprisings in Warsaw against the Nazis. Both of them were crushed. The first one was in the Jewish ghetto in 1943, and we will consider that briefly. And the other one was the following year by the AK, which was citywide. And after that, 85% of the city of Warsaw was destroyed by the Nazis as they retreated. Well, we've mentioned the Warsaw Ghetto just far too briefly. Let's just look at a couple of pictures of it here so we can get some kind of idea. This first picture is from December 1940, so the Nazis have been there for 15 months. They've already set up the ghetto, and it is walled off. It contains about 500,000 Jews, maybe 400,000. And our next picture shows there were civic functions like trams and so on going on behind the walls, but simply separated from the rest of the Polish population. So, as we've said, it contains 400,000 to 500,000 Jews in 1.3 square miles, which is an unimaginable population density. It's 30% of Warsaw's population in just 2.4% of its area. And out of those, about 100,000 died of disease, especially typhus, and also starvation. We've spared you some of the most horrible pictures of all this. And another 250,000 were deported to Treblinka during the late summer of 1942. It was controlled by the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, which was collaborating with the Nazis in the interests, as its members hoped, of minimising deaths and perhaps keeping themselves safe. And the Jewish ghetto police, same story. They allowed themselves to be used in the hope of better treatment. In fact, it didn't save them. It was a self-delusion, which the Nazis consciously fostered. Okay, well, moving on to the effects of Operation Barbarossa in Ukraine. Operation Barbarossa is the name for the Nazi assault upon the Soviet Union in June 1941, bringing the era of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to an end. And we see on this map this kind of outbreak there, a huge number of Nazi forces, around 3 million men, bursting into the Western Soviet Union and reaching the little blue-grey dotted line by December 1941.
I think you had just mentioned this, but just to clarify, previous to this, the Nazis and the Soviets had been allies and were supposedly working together, and this is the point where Germany really breaks that off and kind of goes rogue on the Soviets, right?
Right. Everybody had expected these two to fight at some point anyway. It was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was like a white shock around the world, that these two mortal enemies would make an agreement. It wasn't quite an alliance, it was a non-aggression pact. But it made war certain. And it also made the Soviet Union a de facto ally or collaborator of the Nazis for nearly the first 2 years of the war. And Stalin was the one who was deluding himself that Hitler wouldn't attack, but he did. Yeah. Well, let's just summarise this war, which is at the heart of World War II and basically the most decisive part of it. That's not the story that Brits and Americans tell themselves, but this war was just on a totally different scale. When I was teaching about this subject in college, I would ask students, how many Americans do you think died in World War II? They didn't know. The answer was about 400,000. So then I'd say, how many Brits? About the same, 400,000. How many Yugoslavs? And by now they're looking at me like I'm crazy, like, how are we going to know that? And I'd say, well, this is fair enough, because it's like, what, the 6th, 7th, 8th most important theatre of war. It's pretty low down the pecking order, right? 1 million Yugoslavs died in World War II. So in this not particularly crucial theatre of the war, more people died by some distance than Brits and Americans put together. Okay, the students are settling down nicely now. And then I say, how many Soviets do you think died in the war? And then I tell them, it's 25 million. And of course, jaws drop open all around the room. Right. So then they're ready to hear what I need to tell them about the importance of this conflict.
Right.
So from June 41 until the end of 42, it entails huge German and Axis advances across vast spaces. And then comes the Battle of Stalingrad from July 42, well, maybe a little after that, but late summer, it's building, down to February 1943. And it was the most important battle of the entirety of World War II and marked its turning point. Well, that wasn't completely obvious at the time, but within 6 months or so of that, everybody realised the war was only going to end one way, and it was going to be the defeat of Nazi Germany. Before that, that was not at all obvious. So German and Axis forces thereafter are mostly in retreat. And by 1944, Soviet forces were pushing the Nazis and their allies out of the Soviet Union and into Central and Eastern Europe. So we're going to follow the course of that in respect of our particular interest. Well, our first picture here shows citizens of Moscow. This is quite a famous picture, very nicely colorized, I think. Citizens of Moscow hearing the public announcement of war from Radio Moscow on June 22nd, 1941. And as the Nazis advance, of course, the territory they're moving into first is Eastern Poland, or what had been Eastern Poland, the areas of Poland that the Soviets had occupied in September 1939. And lots of Ukrainians welcomed the Nazis because they were seen as liberators from the horrors of communism, because they'd had an absolutely appalling experience under communism. And that was replicated to some extent as the Nazis moved forward into what had always been Soviet Ukraine. Well, always, between the wars, right? Because they too had, they're the ones who had suffered the Holodomor, the massive famine, just 10 years or less than 10 years before. Furthermore, most Ukrainians, like most Poles and most Russians, were anti-Semitic. So Nazi anti-Semitism didn't bother them. And in any case, local Jews had often been supporters of communism.
Yeah, but we're not saying that all or even most Jews were communists.
No, we're not. Definitely not. All we're saying is that Jews were well overrepresented in the ranks of the Communist Party and communist functionaries. And the same thing was true right around the world. You know, in America, the Communist Party in America, the Communist Party in Britain, they were overrepresented. So if you are given to anti-Semitism anyway, and if you have just suffered appallingly under Stalin's regime that has just invaded, killed a whole lot of people, taken away all the intellectuals, the priests, anybody involved in politics, and so on, and expropriated business people, well, now that the communists have been pushed out, you might well be tempted to take this out on the Jews. And sadly, that is exactly what happened. We also need to remember that a lot of Ukrainians remembered the various misfiring attempts to create a Ukrainian state back in the backwash of World War I. They had not succeeded. And so there was the hope amongst many that if there's going to be a clash of the titans, the Germans and the Soviets, maybe in all of that there's going to be space for an independent Ukraine. And maybe the Germans will support this. Now, in practice, Nazi-occupied Ukraine was also the scene of multi-sided, highly complex fighting and civil war. Now, you and I are used to this idea in respect of World War II in Yugoslavia, which is mind-bogglingly complicated, right, and savage, that the fighting in this part of the world was it was complex, but a little less complex than Yugoslavia, but even more savage. Well, one of the first places that the Nazis reach is Lviv, and before the Soviet secret police retreat in the face of the German advance, they quickly murder all of their 4,000 prisoners there. And this picture shows citizens at one of the town's 3 jails. Radio announcements had called them to identify the bodies of prisoners, their loved ones. And our next picture shows a couple, the woman's holding her throat from the smell, I think, discovering the fate of their loved ones. Now, all of this was an absolute godsend for Nazi propaganda. If you hunt around online, you can find Nazi propaganda news clips showing their heroic forces coming into Lemberg and finding shock horror, the terrible massacre perpetrated by those wicked communists before they fled. Right? Well, the Nazis were carrying out massacres of their own, loads of them. But they were denying all of that. But they were able to pose as people who are liberating populations from massacres of this sort.
Yeah, did the Soviets have a reason for killing all these people before they left, or just...
Well, they certainly didn't value human life,
out of spite?
and they must have hoped that at some stage they'd be able to come back, and they didn't want to have to round all these people up or find them all over again. If they left them there,
right,
they're the sort of people who might well have allowed themselves to be recruited into the Nazi forces. So it was an easy calculation to make, just kill them. Right? They didn't want to. They didn't have the resources to retreat with them because they were simply getting out as fast as they could, and they couldn't pull out quickly enough. So prisoners were simply an encumbrance.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a list here of all the other cities where the NKVD massacred their prisoners, often in truly horrible circumstances. So here are German troops being welcomed in Lviv. But this very, very quickly turns sour indeed. German occupation gives the opportunity for anti-Semitic violence, and the fact that Jews were disproportionately likely, that's all it is, to be communists, gives the excuse.
Are these people welcoming the Nazis of their own free will, or can we assume that these photos are staged?
Yes and yes. Lots of people genuinely did turn out to welcome the Nazis. There was genuine support. But the Nazis were very anxious that their camera people should film as much as possible. So there are plenty of kind of like staged events that clearly are just wooden enough that it's obvious that they've been told, right, you stand here, you do this, you present these flowers, that kind of thing. But the welcome was mostly genuine. I would give just one caveat here. If you are ever unfortunate enough to live in a city that is being invaded by an invading army, the thing to do is to turn out and clap the soldiers as they come in. Right? It's going to be a horrible experience, and it will be made fractionally less horrible if they are made to feel welcome. Sorry, that's a horrible piece of advice.
Did the Jews not participate in this sort of rallying, and that's why, I mean, the Nazis start taking them out immediately as soon as they get there.
I cannot for the life of me imagine that Jews will have turned out to welcome the Nazis in, unless they were doing their best, certain individuals were doing their best to deny that they were Jews, but that would be almost impossible anyway. So, no, I think we can safely say that they weren't. Yeah. Okay, well, so these next pictures are really, in their way, although they're not graphic, they are pretty distressing. So we've got Jews here being arrested by local nationalist militia, and here we've got a bunch of people calling out after this lady who's trying to get away from them, crossing the street. The next one shows a young girl, she can't be more than about 12, would you say, being protected by an older lady whilst others standing around her abusing her, and it looks like they've been stripping her clothes off. And a while later that lady too is attacked in the same way. We've got a very terrible picture here of, is it her or someone else, terrified, half naked, being chased through the streets, basically terrorized. And the number of people killed in the two pogroms that happen in Lviv in that June and July, we don't know the precise numbers. They certainly run to several thousand.
What seems unbelievable is not just that this happened, but that so many were prepared to take part in the violence. I mean, some of these are local people, they would have been living next to these Jews, and all of a sudden now they've just sort of turned on them.
Right. I mean, this is part of the terrible dynamics that happen in ethnic wars. And of course, we saw the same thing happen again in this part of the world in the 1990s, and people who'd known one another forever, or perhaps had been friends, perhaps partly out of fear for their own safety, end up demonizing people they know perfectly well. But ordinary people had suffered hugely under the communists, and people want someone still around to blame, because the actual communist functionaries have just skedaddled out of town. And the Jews were both the traditional outgroup and also somehow connected in the popular mind to the communists. So they're angry about the very recent past, and they're fearful for the future. So lashing out is going to be a common response.
Yeah, and this really just creates the perfect storm for this kind of chaos.
Yeah, it's a perfect storm is what it is. Yeah. So you get people like this guy here recruited into a collaborationist auxiliary police in Lviv. Again in June. I mean, this is all happened within a week. Right? It's only the last 10 days of June that the Nazi invasion is going on, or begins, and here we are. They're in Lviv, and there he is, recruited straight away. Well, we've got some pictures here of Ukrainian villagers welcoming German troops. Lady waving a cross above her head, which of course she wouldn't have been allowed to do under the communists. One of the most embarrassing things is that almost the very first thing to happen when Nazi troops reached a lot of settlements is that the churches, which had been locked up and closed, were opened again. And young children who had not been christened, because they were not allowed to be, suddenly were christened. And they're embarrassed Nazi soldiers dragged by the elbow by some peasant woman to be the godfather in a christening amongst these Slavic subhumans. Right? It just, the whole thing is just totally mind-boggling and almost unmentionable from any point of view nowadays. But that is what happened.
Right.
So here we've got Ukrainians welcoming German motorbike troops. Staged? What do you think? Or real?
It looks like it.
Yeah, it looks a little staged. The next one, I'm not sure it's even quite a welcome. I don't think it's staged. I don't think it's even a welcome. It's just these ladies looking on, not really fearful, not cheering either, watching German troops enter. And this next picture, it's such a great picture, I wanted to include it, even though, if I remember correctly, it's not actually from Ukraine, it's from Latvia or Lithuania, I think. But it's the same phenomenon, right? Places that the communists had recently occupied, Nazi troops moving into, and there are these welcomes. Well, here we have local officials meeting German commanders. And the welcome's mostly genuine, but a lot of them must have been pretty worried what's going to happen now. Probably at this stage, not many of them were afraid of what might happen if the Soviets come back, nearly everybody is fairly confident that the Soviets are going to be beaten. But they are nervous about exactly what the Germans are going to do. Okay, and here we have people digging up Christian symbols, crosses and paraphernalia used in celebrating the Mass and so on, that has been buried in shallow graves. This kind of activity goes back over centuries. It's not exactly that there's a tradition, it's just a natural kind of response. You got this during some areas that were subject to frequent religious change during the Reformation. People would just bury stuff, partly out of attachment to the form of religion that was currently out of favour, and partly because they were unsure whether they might not need it again at some point in the future.
So the Soviets would have closed down all the churches when they had arrived back in the fall of 1939?
They'd certainly closed down almost all of them in what had been the Soviet Union before 1939. I'm afraid I don't know, but I strongly suspect that they had closed down the large majority during those 21 months in formerly Eastern Poland.
That would have been because communism, you can't be communist and religious.
Right. This is a big subject to itself, and I see that although it's not on our already very long list of topics we need to cover in future episodes, I can see at once from that question that this is something that we need to talk about at some future point, and certainly we will. This next picture is both bizarre and offensive. Right? This is Hitler wyzwoliciel. So it seems crazy to us to present Hitler to Ukrainians as a liberator, but it made some kind of sense to them, so the Nazis had no compunction about doing it. And this next one is just a flyer. It's a trump card, really. Don't shed your blood for Stalin. And our next one is clearly aimed at garnering Ukrainian support.
Yeah, it's saying, look, we're driving out the Bolsheviks, but implying that they might allow a Ukrainian state?
That's yeah, exactly right. They're not saying they will, because they won't. But if local Ukrainian nationalists want to delude themselves into thinking that they will, then that's fine by them, because that means they'll keep the peace and maybe even help the Nazi cause. That's what's going on here. Yeah. And our next one is aimed at Belarusian peasants in the countryside, a poster encouraging locals to help throw out the Stalinist bandits from the Belarusian homeland. Good grief. Okay, well, the Nazis push on into central and eastern Ukraine, and Kiev had been badly bombed in June 1941, well before the Nazi forces actually reached there. They didn't actually capture the city until September and made 60,000 Soviet defending troops prisoner.
These faces are
It's an incredible photograph, isn't it? Yeah. They've already endured tortures for 20 years as part of the Soviet Union, including being starved to within an inch of their lives during the early 1930s, and now there's this. And they really must wonder, is the agony ever going to end? Which is a very real question. Well, following the capture of the city in September, which itself caused a lot of destruction, NKVD troops hid in the central area and blew it up because it was housing a whole lot of German troops and administrators. So that smashed up Kiev even more. Outside the city, there's a place called Babi Yar, and the Nazis made it a killing ground from 1941 to 43. Now you can see the window of numbers of dead people is extremely large, because we don't really know. Perhaps as few as 70,000 or up to 200,000 people, Jews, Roma, communists and others murdered here, simply taken there, shot, bodies covered up, next layer, and so on for months and months.
Oh, why would the Nazis be killing Roma?
Well, they think of them as being Untermenschen, subhuman, just as they think of Jews and indeed Slavs. I mean, they have a kind of like racial pecking order, and the Jews and the Roma were simply slated for elimination. Slavs, not necessarily, insofar as they could be used. Their lives were considered totally valueless by the Nazis, but if they could be kept alive to work for the Nazi project or as slave labour, that was okay. But in respect of the Jews and the Roma, no, they simply wanted to kill them. And these, although these photos aren't graphic at all, they're nevertheless heartbreaking. These are some Jews in an assembly point outside Lubny on the way to execution. And the second picture here shows a mother with her children at the same place.
Did these people know that they were being taken to their deaths?
It's hard not to think that at least the adults realised. Of course, they were being told a load of rubbish about relocation, just like when people were taken to the death camps in Auschwitz and so on. But if you're in that situation and you've got children, it's better to repeat the lie to your children to keep them calm.
Were the Nazis already known at this point for treating people this way?
Yes.
Did they already have a reputation?
Yes. Certainly, if you'd had any kind of contact with them at all, or had contacts, then you would pretty much know what to expect. Yes. And certainly, as we've seen, for example, in Lviv, local people who were anti-Semitic felt that with the arrival of the Nazis, they'd got free license to turn on their Jewish neighbours. So that knowledge was certainly there. Yeah. Our next picture shows SS troops approaching Mariupol, which of course has been in the news again recently.
Yeah, that's the city that the Russian forces leveled to the ground 2 years ago when the war started.
Right, absolutely. There was ferocious fighting there, and yeah, the city was basically entirely destroyed. So, yeah, but here's Mariupol, 80 years earlier, and a battle zone again. Here are German forces entering Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, and we've got a bunch of pictures, not simply of the Germans entering, but of life in occupied Ukraine. So we're going to click through these very, very quickly. So destructions inevitably created homelessness, as you can see these people moving their remaining belongings on a cart, while some buildings that would have been better destroyed had survived. Sorry, I couldn't resist the nasty remark there.
Yeah, this is your favorite kind of architecture.
Absolutely. Knock it all down, I say. Ugh. Well, what did its chief proponents say? A home is a machine for living in. Well, yes, that's if you think people are machines. And certainly the communists did. Okay, well, as you can see from this map, by late 1941, the Nazis had advanced right up to the white line here.
So by the end of the year, they've advanced hundreds of miles, but they still haven't captured Leningrad, Moscow, or Stalingrad.
No. And they never would. Well, you could argue that they kind of did in Stalingrad. The battle was right in the middle of the city there, but they never definitively really took it. They besieged Leningrad and for a couple of years, and at the cost of 1 million lives, or more than 1 million, I think about 1.25 million lives in Leningrad. The people in that city just endured hell on earth, and as in the famine in Ukraine in the early 30s, people there, some of them were reduced to cannibalism. So, but yet, no, they never did take them. Well, we're going to retreat a little behind the front lines now to see what's going on in Western Ukraine, and in particular we want to look at some very controversial topics which are surfacing again now, particularly in Russian propaganda and Russian depictions of Ukraine today, and that is the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, and Stepan Bandera, and the Galician SS. At slight risk of caricature, but we're trying to simplify complicated stories here, as we are in pretty much all of our episodes. The period of Nazi occupation in Western Ukraine now, can be divided really into three main phases. Firstly, Ukrainian nationalists hoping that the Nazis will let them create a Ukrainian state, and the Nazis humouring these hopes, but with no intention of allowing it. Secondly, disillusion, when the OUN, the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists, decides, they're not going to do it, so we're going to fight the Nazis. And the Nazis respond by imprisoning Stepan Bandera, their leader, in Germany. And then a phase late in the war, when the Soviets are clearly winning, the Nazis release Bandera for him to raise forces to help resist the Soviet advance. And through all of these phases, we should mention, Ukrainians and Poles are engaged in inter-ethnic massacres of one another. Well, here we have, early in the occupation, Ukrainian nationalists demonstrating for an independent Ukraine. And the Nazi officials simply smiling and letting it carry on, but not doing a lot about it. Here we have a poster, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, it seems like they have a same slogan now as they did back then.
That's it. And here's one calling for a Ukrainian independent sovereign state. Okay, and this picture showing a Ukrainian Insurgent Army, probably in 1943, and here actually capturing a number of German soldiers during the phase when they are fighting the Nazis. But as the Germans start to lose the wider war, the UPA becomes de facto allies of the Nazis in a doomed bid to hold off the advancing Soviets. And of course that has played into the hands of the communists at the time and during and after the war, and the Russian government today, which wants to portray these people as Nazis. Well, what certainly is true is that right through this period, the UPA were massacring Poles. Between 60,000 and 120,000 are killed from 1943 to 45. It's an attempt to ensure that Galicia could not be part of any post-war Polish state. There were Polish counter-massacres, but killing far fewer people, 2,000 to 3,000 Ukrainians, which is obviously bad enough. And we have here an account, which I've sanitized just a little, because this stuff was just so gruesome, of a Polish partisan. So he says, we reacted to their attacks, which reached unspeakable levels of barbarity, with a ruthlessness of our own. When we overran a Ukrainian settlement, we systematically took out the men of fighting age and executed them, often by letting them run 40 paces ahead of us and shooting them in the back. This was considered the most humane method. Others in the unit, whose actions I will describe, behaved differently and exacted a terrible revenge. No one raised a finger to stop them. If none of our number murdered babies, then it was the only atrocity that we did not commit. So he's admitting to quite a lot there.
Yeah.
Okay, about the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. It's the military wing of the OUN, the Organisation of Ukrainian Nationalists, led by Stepan Bandera. As we've said, he was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp from 1941 to 44. The army engaged in brutal ethnic cleansing of Poles, as we've just seen, in Volhynia and Galicia, fighting both Nazis and Soviets, but in the fall of 1944 it agreed to be armed by and cooperate with the Nazis to try and keep out the returning Red Army. And it continued guerrilla war after World War II was over, continued fighting Soviet occupation until 1954.
You're sure that's not a typo? 1954?
Yeah, I'm sure that's not a typo. There were guerrilla attacks on Soviet officials, police, military and so on in a whole belt of what became the Western Soviet Union after 1945. So in Western Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltics, for years, on into the early 1950s, and in some cases, yes, down to 1954. They could not possibly succeed. And I didn't know about this myself until some years ago. Certainly my education had never told me anything about it, and it wasn't just that the Soviet Union was so good at keeping the outside world uninformed. To talk a lot about it in the West was to emphasize just how evil our great ally in World War II was. So even during the Cold War, there was a kind of a vested interest in, not talking about this kind of stuff too much. Well, here's our man, Stepan Bandera, is extremely controversial. Was he a nationalist hero who fought both Nazis and communists? Yes, he was. Was he an anti-Semite whose forces massacred Jews and Poles? Yes, he was. Well, after the war, he went to live in West Germany, in Munich, actually, and you can see he dies in 1959. He is assassinated there by a Soviet agent in 1959. But there are statues up to him in loads of Ukrainian cities today, including Lviv, squares and streets named after him. And Ukrainians will uniformly tell you that he was a good guy. He was just a Ukrainian nationalist. He certainly wasn't a Nazi. He fought the Nazis. Well, this is part of the truth.
Yeah, the title of hero really depends on who you are, I guess.
It depends upon selective vision. He's a hero if you want to see him as someone who fought against both of these great evils, but then you need to close your eyes to the evils that he and his group perpetrated. That's something I'm afraid that as human beings we're all too good at. But as the war went on and it was clear that the Nazis were losing, they turned to raising people directly into their own forces and formed a Galician SS division. Now, the Nazis did this in very many of the countries that they occupied. In Norway, there was a Dutch SS, there was a Bosnian SS. The French SS were amongst the last troops defending Berlin at the very bitter end of the war. So there's one raised in Galicia as well, and here we have a poster recruiting people for it, and here we have some women dressed out in nice local ethnic costumes in a parade sending the Galician SS off to the front. Well, let's look now at someone who is a genuine hero in this situation, and this is Archbishop Andrzej Szeptycki. He had been Greek Catholic Archbishop of Lviv since 1901. What are the Greek Catholics? This is something we'll look at in 2 episodes' time, in the last episode in this series, when we will be interviewing someone who works for the church in ecumenics and teaches in one of their universities. We'll talk about Szeptycki a little bit there as well. He is a hugely important figure in West Ukrainian public life. He'd hoped that there would be an independent Ukraine, but he came to realise that the Nazis would never allow it. Now, if we can criticise him, it is because he was too patient of the Nazis generally, even though he never had any time at all for their vicious anti-Semitism. Together with his brother Clementi, who was a monk, he systematically hid large numbers of Jews, including in his own house as well as in the institutions that he controlled in his position as Archbishop, and made vehement public protests against Nazi genocide, which nearly led to his own arrest. I think it was Himmler who quipped that we would have we would have killed him, but we had respect for his age. Well, the Nazis didn't respect anybody, age or otherwise. If they didn't kill him, though they were tempted to do so, it was because they realised that that would alienate large numbers of people in Western Ukraine whose support they needed in a tight spot. So he really did go out on a limb, but it's perhaps because he hadn't condemned the Nazis earlier on that he hasn't been given the title of righteous among the Gentiles by the State of Israel, but his brother has. But nevertheless, he was very brave and was perhaps fortunate to die in November 44, shortly after the Soviets came back. Well, while all of this stuff is going on, even while the Germans are carrying out their own massacres, they are discovering Soviet massacres and utilise them ruthlessly for their own propaganda purposes, just as they had when they first moved into Lviv. So, for example, they came across a mass grave in May 1943 of 9,432 Ukrainians who'd been shot by the NKVD in the late 1930s at Vinnytsia. So this is a Nazi poster here depicting the animal-like Bolshevik with the star on his head above a picture of all these human remains dug up in Vinnytsia. And the previous month they'd discovered the graves of the Polish officers killed by the Soviets in Katyn, and they hastened to publicise them. That they brought in international experts, including from allied countries like Britain, to say, look, come and look. This was the Soviets. It was not us. Look how barbaric and wicked those horrible Soviets were. And one of the most shameful episodes in British and American wartime history is that even though the evidence was indeed compelling, Churchill and Roosevelt affected to believe Stalin when he said that these were people the Nazis had killed, even though it was quite obvious that that wasn't the case. So
this massacre was really carried out by the Soviets in the spring of 1940, and we discussed it in last week's
That's
episode.
Right. Yes. This is, I'm afraid, a story that's going to roll right down to even beyond the end of the Cold War, and we will refer to it in our next episode. So here is a Nazi poster directed at Poles, reminding them about Katyn. This is unlikely to make the Poles support the Nazis, but it's certainly going to alienate them further from the Soviets. Well, you might remember from last week's episode, it wasn't just the Polish military officers who'd been taken to the Soviet Union, but loads of public officials and their families, anybody remotely wealthy. They were simply taken out and sent deep into Siberia. Well, once the Soviet Union itself was invaded by the Nazis, the status of these prisoners changed somewhat. They are now people who are at least potentially allied with the Soviets against the Nazis, and so they are allowed to leave the Soviet Union. So here we have a picture of some women carrying children and belongings and what have you. There were hundreds of thousands who had survived. Many had died actually in captivity. They're allowed to leave, and they're sent out of Central Asia into Iran in February 1943. Here's a load of them sailing across the Caspian Sea from Soviet territory to Pahlavi in Iran, and from there most of them went west. Here's a picture of a load of Poles who've recently arrived in Iran. Most of the menfolk and some of the women went on to the Middle East and North Africa and joined up with the British Army. And the Poles formed a very important part of the British Army for the rest of the war, and fought with real distinction, particularly in Italy, like in Monte Cassino, as you can see in this picture here of some Polish troops fighting as part of the British Army in the spring of 1944, but also in the liberation particularly of the Netherlands and in other places.
So why did the Soviets suddenly, have this change of heart and let all these people go? I mean, you said they were sort of allies of the Soviets?
Well, those people won't have seen themselves as allies of the Soviets. So asking them suddenly to fight for the Soviets against the Nazis would have been asking a bit too much. You couldn't expect them to do it. You have to keep them prisoner instead. Far better then to stop having to feed them by sending them out to people they did approve of, like the British, even though it was an awful long way to go, right, out of Siberia into Iran, across the Middle East, to join up with the British there. So they were very pragmatic in a sense. There's a long history of communist policy, not just in the Soviet Union but elsewhere, just turning right around on a dime, and doing the opposite of what it's been doing up until that point. Well, meanwhile, back in Ukraine, here's an SS officer handing out Nazi flags in Kiev to Ukrainian youths on the second anniversary of their liberation from the Bolsheviks. If I'd been a teenager in Kiev in September 1943, well, I might have continued to want to humour these German officers, but I think by then I'd have been suspecting that the Soviets were about to come back. And in any way, my experience of the Nazis by then would have been bad enough that I'm not exactly going to be enthusiastic about them being here at all. I'll have been a lot more ambivalent. Moving further west, looking back to Lviv, or Lvov in Polish, of course. Here is a tolerably recent movie, In Darkness, based on the true story of a Polish sewage inspector and criminal, a chap called Leopold Socha, who hid Jews from the ghetto in the sewers, saving a number of them from certain death. So if anybody wants to get the feel of what Nazi occupation in Ukraine would have been like, this might be quite a good way into it. We do need to mention, of course, the yet again the terrible fate of the Jews. This map shows us the locations of the worst of the extermination camps, basically, in occupied Poland. The orange line shows the frontiers of Poland as they had existed before 1939. So you can see those main camps there: Auschwitz, Chelmno, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Belzec, and so on. They're all within what had been Polish territory. Okay, so the war is grinding on. The Nazis are now falling back, being driven back remorselessly, and Soviet troops have reached where else but Vinnytsia. I mean, I think this is a great photograph. It's at this place, as we say here, it's about 160 miles west of Kiev in March 1944, and people do the sensible thing and they turn out to welcome the Soviet troops. Are they glad to see the Nazis gone? Probably. Are they glad to see the Soviets come back? Almost certainly not. Remember, nearly 9,500 of them had been killed in the Stalinist purge of the late 1930s.
Yeah, these people are really stuck between two monsters.
Well, yes, and that is the plight. In a sense, that's like the central motif of this whole episode, that everybody in East Central Europe is stuck between absolutely monstrous evils and either forced to choose, or more frequently to try and navigate and at least survive via some tortuous route or other between them, even though circumstances are militating even against that. Well, as the Germans pull back, they start to imitate Russian tactics and start to burn villages to deprive the advancing Soviets of them. What are the Soviets doing? Well, Stalin is deporting smaller ethnicities. He'd done this from the beginning, but much more after his forces started to win the war. Deporting smaller ethnicities that he feared had helped the Germans, and sending them from, say, the Caucasus or other locations on the Volga and so on, deep into Siberia, partly to get them away from the front lines, but partly also simply as collective punishment.
This is where Stalin's deportation of the Crimean Tatars comes in, right?
Right. That is the most famous of them. And they weren't allowed back until the very end of the Soviet Union. right? So, and by then, of course, like new generations had grown up. So it's really like destruction of people groups. I mean, which itself is a constant theme of the absolute turmoil of the 20th century, right? That the modern ideologies make it harder and harder for different kinds of people to live together, and the cultural and social destruction wrought by nationalism, socialism, and indeed even democracy. But we're getting off track there, but I'll just throw that out there. Has been massive, and this is just one more episode in that bigger picture.
Yeah, it seems like both fascism and communism just have little regard for personal human life.
Yeah, they don't. You could extend the argument that political ideologies don't. They don't see people, they see their idea, right? Well, the Nazis and the communists were the most extreme and ruthless forms of that, yeah. Okay, well, we will deal just very briefly with the Warsaw Ghetto, though there's so much that could be said about it. In January 1943, anybody surviving in the Warsaw Ghetto knew that they were going to be killed. And so if you know you're definitely going to die, that makes you brave, because you're not afraid of being killed. So they rose in revolt, and with smuggled weapons, improvised weapons, weapons taken from soldiers they'd managed to kill, and so on. And the fighting lasted for 3 months until it was eventually crushed, and then any survivors were indeed killed. And the ghetto was destroyed. You can see here a picture of the rubble. It was just systematically blown up. During the course of 1944, the tide of the war had obviously turned. The Soviets were retaking all of Ukraine on their way to winning the Second World War. And this then puts people like the Poles in a very invidious position. Here is a very strange picture. Red Army soldiers and Polish Armia Krajowa, Home Army soldiers, in the streets of Vilnius. The Poles considered the city theirs. Between the world wars, it had been theirs. The Soviets not only didn't recognise that, they didn't even recognise the AK as a legitimate force. And as the war ended, they would crush it, kill a load of its leaders, and imprison a load more. But what could the Poles do? They had to simply fight on in the hope that some kind of independent Poland would emerge from the end of the war. And of course, really, it didn't. Here we have a picture of Soviet tanks reaching Lviv in July 1944. And now it's time to look at some Soviet propaganda again, because the problem for the Soviets now was to persuade Ukrainians and other East Europeans that liberation by the Soviets was something to be welcomed. Which, well, it wasn't, right? That's not that the Nazis were better, but that people could see by now that the communists were pretty much as bad. So this poster's emphasising Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood. So we're appealing back to ethnic loyalties, because you're not going to get people turning out to cheer for socialism or for Stalin, that's for sure. Our army is a liberation army of workers. And here we have a heroic Red Army soldier, very impressively dressed, greeting shoeless peasants in Western Ukraine and Belarus.
And we learned from one of our previous episodes that the communists were not necessarily this well dressed.
Right, yes. Well, dealing very briefly with the Warsaw Uprising, again we could spend a long time on this, but we're compressing a lot of material into one episode here. This happens in August and September 1944, so it's not happening in the ghetto's already gone. The Jews have all been murdered. This is in the wider society, and it breaks out in the late summer of 1944.
Yeah, so what was the reasoning behind this? Warsaw people wanted to be the ones to liberate the city instead of the Red Army?
The Red Army was at the gates when the uprising started, and the point of the uprising was that the Polish army would liberate Warsaw. We're not beholden to the Red Army. So the Red Army did absolutely nothing to help them. They simply stopped advancing because they wanted the Nazis to crush the uprising, to kill as many of the AK as possible, and to make it clear that Warsaw was being liberated from the Nazis by the Red Army, so that they would be the people in charge after the war. So we've got a whole bunch of pictures here we're going to move through quite quickly now. It's the Sare Sergi, the Grey Ranks, based on Polish Scouting Association. Polish child couriers, and even a child nurse. Look at this little dab. You can see from her dates, though, that fortunately, although she doesn't live to be old, she outlives the war by a long way, and makes a later life in France, where she gets married and has 2 children, which is a relief to know. And this guy here with a Błyskawica submachine gun. So they're making these improvised submachine guns in occupied Warsaw. How much ingenuity and determination is required to do that? But they did it. Women and girls fighting in the uprising and actually capturing Germans. But here are the SS preparing for street fighting to put them down. And an Azeri battalion also.
Wait, the Azeris, they're, an awfully long way from home.
They are. So they belong in the Caucasus. But a lot of people from Soviet forces, Soviet prisoners of war, had been recruited into German forces. Some at the point of a gun, and others because they wanted either some kind of national independence from the Soviet Union, or they simply didn't want communism. So there's a whole mixture of reasons. And our next picture illustrates again the same point. So here's General Heinz Reinhardt with Cossack officers, whose troops also helped in putting down the Warsaw Uprising.
These are more Soviet citizens that are in the Nazi army.
Yes. At the other side of Europe, between 20 and 25% of all the troops captured by the British, the Americans, the Canadians in Normandy after D-Day were Soviet citizens. So very, very large numbers of them. As I say, some of them were forced to join up, and others had a whole mixture of reasons for actually wanting to. Well, in the end, the Warsaw Uprising, of course, is destroyed after 3 months. The Polish fighters killed almost as many Germans, around 15,000, as they lost themselves. But, as you can see, civilian deaths were more like 150,000.
Yeah, so the civilians are really the main losers in all of this.
As they tend to be in most conflicts, particularly in urban settings, yes. There tend to be more civilians killed in urban battlegrounds than soldiers. Yeah. And as the Nazis did withdraw from Warsaw in the face of the Red Army, Hitler ordered the city to be completely destroyed. Well, 85% of it was, and this picture is taken in 1950, 5 years after the war ended, and it's just acres and acres and acres of rubble, as you can see, just terrible. Well, finally, this map shows that all of Ukraine was included in the Soviet Union. The territory Stalin had seized in September 1939 was never returned to post-war Poland. This is a bitter experience for all Ukrainians, but especially for those in the West. And we're going to turn to that end of war and post-war situation in next week's episode. So this has been fairly breathless, for which I apologise, and we'll try and be a bit more disciplined in the amount of material we try and include in next week's episode. Thank you for staying with us this long, people.
Thanks, everybody, and don't forget to like and share.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Okay, goodbye now.